So welcome those who have been here before, welcome back. And those who, this is your first time, welcome to QASIG and welcome to Quardev. My name is Joe Dillon. I'm the CEO of Quardev and one of the founders of the SIG. This will be, do we update this? Yeah. So this is coming up on the second to last QASIG event of the year, and this will be our 12th year of hosting these. And it's the community of people who have made it great, and thank you for doing that. So before I introduce our speaker tonight, I have some sad news to relay. So one of our own members of the QASIG, I'm sure some of you know him, Gerald Lutz, works at Cisco. He's been coming to these things on and off. He and his brother were riding a motorcycle up in Kirkland last week and crashed near a major tree. So our sincere wishes of goodwill go out to him and his family. His parental family lost two brothers on the same day. His family has a son who was pretty close. So our best wishes to Gerald, and if you guys know him, you can find some information about him online also. I can get their way to get in touch with their family, I think, although I don't tell them for sure. But anyway, it's kind of sad, but I think that's the first time, at least that I know of, that anything tragic has happened in our group. So I'll leave your bio to you in your introduction. So this is Gerald, excuse me, Uriah McKinney, and he's with Deloitte and formerly Ubermind. Yep. Our next speaker, next one, they're Ken Johnson and Sept from Microsoft. So I'll remind you about that again. We also have a door prize. So enjoy.
All right. Well, I'll get to my intro in just a moment, but before we begin, I think it's important to get a couple things out of the air. So a little shameless self-promotion. This is my Twitter handle. Please feel free to follow me, live tweet me, or whatever you would like to do with those 5 letters. If you follow me, I'll follow you back, and then we can have great conversations in the ether. A group of people that primarily people I work with, but we also have someone from Zillow who's helping us out a lot as well. It's putting together an open space event called Matcom. It's happening Friday, October 19th in Seattle at the Lake Washington Rowing Club. I would love to get as many people there as our self-imposed limit of 75 can handle. So if you have questions about this, feel free to check out the website, follow us on Twitter, talk to me, or many of my compatriots from Deloitte Digital who are here about that afterwards. We also have some flyers at the sign-in station, so you're welcome to take those. All right. Well, let's get into it. As mentioned, my name is Uriah McKinney. I work for a company called Deloitte Digital. Up until January 3rd, that company was called Ubermind, at which point we were acquired by our new friendly corporate masters as the heart of a new service line called Deloitte Digital. That service line, amongst other things, are focused on mobile development, and prior to being acquired, we were a mobile agency primarily focused on iOS, Android, native applications, as well as mobile and responsive web. So that's a little bit of framing about me. The reason I'm here, the reason I chose this topic is not because I'm an expert by any means. I've been doing mobile agile quality assurance for about verging on 5 years now. I think we've learned a lot as we've transitioned from a broadly speaking agile practice to a more tightly defined Scrum practice. But again, I'm by no means an expert. We have an opportunity here to either listen to me entertainingly drone on for about an hour, or have a conversation. And so if we want to depart from the scripted events of tonight, let's do that, and let's get into it. So again, we've learned some things during our transition, which I'm going to be describing, but these are by no means a one-size-fits-all solution. Your mileage may vary, and let's get into it. So I'm going to start with just a brief primer on how I understand Scrum, because I think in order to have a reasonable conversation, we need to at least speak in the same language. So can I just get a show of hands? Who here is familiar with Scrum? Who here is in a shop where you are doing what you call Scrum? Okay, very different. Okay. Who here thinks they know what Scrum means? All right.
You're not gonna run me, right?
That's one of the many, many possible answers. I'm just a couple slides, and hopefully I won't drone on too much about this, which I have a tendency to do, so we can just level set. So I believe that the value of Scrum is providing value. And what that really means is you take what is most valuable to the person that you're building the thing for. And for us, that's our client, which is not the same as our end user. But if you're a product development company, it's probably going to be your end user. Maybe it's your VP or your president or your CEO. But whoever is the person who's driving the vision for the product, you're building the highest priority items first, the most valuable items first. And one of the interesting things that Scrum takes into account is those priorities might change. That value is fluid. And so by using a combination of prioritization and inflection points, you're able to actually consistently deliver value in a way that if you know you need to release, you can package things up and release, even if you didn't get the 17 features that you originally started out to get. In Scrum, there's teams and there's stakeholders, and I'm not going to go into pigs and chickens, but if you're interested in funny Scrum stories, we can talk about that later. There's essentially the individuals of the team, and I'll briefly talk about those. There's essentially 3 roles. There is the team members, and those are individuals who are contributing to the value that the Scrum team is delivering. So I don't think it's necessarily valuable to dive into exactly what that means, but they're essentially the individual contributors. Within a Scrum team, there are 2 specialized roles. The role of the Scrum Master, and without getting into too much detail, the Scrum Master is the one who makes certain that the things that are blocking the progress of value get resolved. And then there's a product owner. The product owner is the individual on the team who sets the priorities and sets the order of the priorities, and also determines what the vision for the project is. Does all make sense? Sort of in line with what you guys have experienced? For us, the product owner ideally is on the client side. So we're a consultancy, we deliver projects for clients, so our clients should be telling us what we should be delivering. That doesn't always happen, and so we have ways to proxy for that. Scrum Master can actually be anyone on the team who isn't the product owner. That's a bad choice if you're trying to do both. Oftentimes it's our engagement managers, but equally often it's our lead quality assurance engineer. We've also done some experiment. Actually, Alex told me about how he likes to ramp up Scrum teams, which is to let everyone on the team be the Scrum Master for a few sprints. So So everyone gets to experience that role. It really helps to ground the experience, the process and methodology.
It's the rotating Scrum Master.
It's rotating Scrum Master. And then, so there's lots of ways to implement it, and we certainly don't have a set in stone, the PM is always the Scrum Master. That's certainly not how we do it. Outside of the team, there's typically people who have a vested interest in the outcome of the project, but not really any responsibility for the project. Those are the stakeholders. One of the primary roles, or one of the primary tasks for the product owner, and to a lesser extent, the Scrum Master, is to prevent the stakeholders from derailing the team. Mm-hmm. So they act as a bit of a shield. This is an approximation of a sprint cycle. I'm not going to get into too much detail here, but the couple points I want to highlight. A sprint is simply a defined period of time during which you commit to producing certain things, and ideally you produce those things. This diagram indicates that it's 2 to 4 weeks, but really can be any defined period of time. At Deloitte Digital, it's more often 1 to 2 weeks. That's 5 to 10 business days. I've heard people talk about their sprints being 6 weeks long. In theory, you could do an hour-long sprint if you wanted to. There's, at the beginning of a sprint, there's some planning. At the end of the sprint, you review what you do, and you have some daily check-ins with the team throughout. But as this is not intended to teach you all how to do Scrum, I'm going to leave it at that. If you want to ask more questions, you can. Sashimi is a concept that's not, strictly speaking, Scrum, but it is oftentimes used in Scrum. The idea is you deliver a thin slice of complete functionality every time. Anytime you commit to delivering something, you deliver the entire stack. So another way to think of this is as a layer cake. So if you say you're going to deliver authentication, well, you define what that means. You give it a definition, done. But you implement every single thing that you need to, from back-end architecture all the way through user experience, workflows, information architecture, and final design, and test it all, and then deliver. It's not delivered if you don't have everything you're committing to. So this slide really is to sort of ground the theoretical that we talked about in the previous slides with what we actually do at Deloitte Digital. And as an aside, I may refer to Deloitte Digital as Ubermind, because I worked there for a while, and it's still kind of ingrained in me to say Ubermind. I'm going to treat those two things as equivalent. So,
right. I have a question about,
sure.
And tell me if you're going to get to this later, but I'm curious about having a sprint of a fixed length as per a project is what people are wanting to do, and then having a deliverable, if we could ship this thing at demoed at the end of the sprint, versus minimizing rework. And the way I see it, I don't see how you can have all three all the way through the product. So,
well, I wasn't planning to get into that, but I'll just briefly,
great.
and then afterwards we can dive a little bit deeper into that.
Yeah.
One of the necessary things that you're going to have to accept if you strongly adopt an agile work frame, or an agile framework rather, is the decision. You're going to need to make the decision that you are okay with refactoring. And in fact, refactor mercilessly is a clarion call to not necessarily Scrum, but agile development in general, and especially extreme programming, which we borrow a lot of our development practice from extreme programming. Scrum is more a project managerial framework rather than a way to talk about implementing code. So from our perspective, it is not a bad thing to refactor, because what you want to do is deliver a minimum viable product every sprint. Now, this doesn't mean that it's going to be releasable every sprint. Like, you couldn't necessarily put it in a box and sell it in a big box retailer, like Best Buy. But you should be able to demonstrate it, and it should be functional, and it should be defect-free. It should clearly demonstrate the information architecture. It should clearly demonstrate the design. Now, again, those things can change later on, and that's okay.
But it allows you to, that takes care of dependencies. You can make the less dependent pieces.
Yeah.
Or the more dependent pieces later on.
Yeah, and actually, if you want, we can talk a little bit about that. That's a slightly orthogonal to what the primary discussion is, but afterwards, if you want to stick around, we can have a conversation about that.
Thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions before we dive into it? Okay. No? Good. All right, so this is essentially three of the things that make us Scrum butts. You guys heard of Scrum butts?
Yeah.
We do Scrum butts. We don't always do exactly what we say we should always do. So our teams are co-located, except when they're not. So we're our product owner, who I've defined as part of the team, is ideally from the client. And the client could be in Seattle, because we have some clients in Seattle, but we also have some clients in New York. We have some clients in Minneapolis. We have some clients in California, several places in California. So our product owner is not always with us. And at least in our teams, while our engineering disciplines are highly co-located to the point where we're sitting across from each other and oftentimes interrupt each other's workflow by asking questions, which is great. Our creative folks, user experience and graphic design and UI design, aren't always co-located with us. One of the reasons is they're off. It's not uncommon for them to work on multiple projects, and so they've got a different type of setup. So we're not fully co-located in the idealized utopian world. We are both multidisciplinary and cross-functional, but we're more multidisciplinary in terms of our team structure. So I'm a quality assurance engineer, and I work with software developers. We don't have, we have some individuals that cross over multiple roles, but most of our individuals have a defined primary role. And while, going back to the idea of the sashimi, you're delivering everything when you commit to a user story. But there's a lot of discovery that's difficult to fit into a typical sprint structure, especially when you're dealing with a very short time frame, 5 business days. So we actually do some pre-work there. It's a little bit more traditional in terms of upfront cost per discovery that we call sprint zero. And so these are 3 of the big ways that we veer from tight, from pure Scrum, as it were. But we're pretty Scrummy. This is kind of an inside joke which none of you will get, but I'll explain it. So I have a friend who's a filmmaker, and he does some pretty silly films. There was this really great piece of dialogue where one of his characters was having this really horrible time wrestling with this problem, and it just didn't make sense to him. And it's like fitting a blue peg into a red hole. But hopefully that was going to generate a little more laughter. But really what I'm trying to get around here is based on my personal experience on reading blog posts, going to conferences, having conversations, there seems to be a lot of mental churn about how do we slot in QA with Scrum. It just doesn't make sense. But from my perspective, it's actually not all that hard. There's just these mental and logistical blocks that we need to get over. And so that's what I want to talk about, and that's going to be the bulk of the conversation. So some of these are personal mental blocks, and some of these are logistical things that are sometimes largely outside of our control. In order to really impact change, especially if, let's say, your VP, who is in charge of your budget, is blocking you from really fully integrating into an agile development cycle, you need to figure out a way to convince him or her that what you're proposing is actually what they want. And so diplomacy is pretty key. Also, knowing how to schedule things and when to schedule things, and especially being able to prioritize that, is pretty essential. And so these 2 quotes, I think, are fundamental to what we're about to enter into in terms of discussion. Any Doctor Who fans? Woo! What's the best thing about the TARDIS, other than it travels through space and time?
Bigger on
bigger
the
on the
inside than it is on the outside.
Damn straight. So, you know how a sprint is similar to the TARDIS? People think you can fit a lot more into it than you can actually fit. So this is a pretty great metaphor for anything agile. Everyone's thinking in your sprints the TARDIS. So these, most of what we're going to get into are really the scheduling logistic challenges. So these are 5 of the challenges that we've encountered in our agile transformation. And we've handled them in various ways in terms of how robustly we've managed to get there. And really it goes from top to bottom in terms of how great we've been at finding solutions to these challenges. So we'll start out with the easy stuff. So the challenge for us is our sprints are essentially 5 to 10 business days, assuming you don't want to work the weekends. That's not a lot of time. Our teams are small, so the most Scrum Primers will say an ideal Scrum team is 7 plus or minus 2 people. Now we're multi-disciplinary in our approach, so we've got engagement managers. They're basically sort of like a combination account manager and project manager. We've got a product owner on the client side. We've got software developers. We've got user experience and interaction designers. We've got quality assurance. So you do the math, maybe you get 1 or 2 QA on most projects. We've got a couple projects with more than that, but 3's typically where we cap out. So that's a pretty small team, not much time. The other really interesting thing is, for us at least, is that clients like to see metrics. Numbers are really cool. They give our product owners the ability to go to their bosses and say, look, we have a bigger number now. Give us more money. So, and teams, generally, at least from my experience, teams like to say, look, we've done more numbers now. Aren't we great? And we're closer to the number that we're trying to reach. And so velocity is used to track what you've done in terms of story points, which is a type of relative measuring. I'm not going to get into too much of that right now, but we can talk more about that later. Unless you guys ask questions, in which case we'll diverge. And it allows you to make an estimate for how much you'll get done in the future based on the tracking of how much you've gotten done historically. It's a pretty nice way of getting any sort of numeric data in a framework that doesn't have a lot of numeric data. And so everyone's pushing for more and more velocity. Velocity is great. But if everyone wants to fit in as much dev time as possible into your sprints, when are you going to regression? When are you going to regress your application to ensure that you haven't broken anything that you just delivered 3 sprints ago? It's a bit of a challenge. So these all kind of meld together. The way we've addressed this is by no means the only way we've addressed this, but a really effective way that just kind of, I didn't come up with this, I wish I had. It just blew my mind when someone said what they were going to be doing, which is you don't put the regression test pass at the end of the sprint. You put it at the beginning of the next sprint. And here's why. So you want to make certain that the stuff you're delivering this sprint works. And you want to make certain that the direct intersection points of that new code with the old code is functional. But it takes a non-trivial amount of time to make certain that everything that's ever happened that wasn't supposed to happen still isn't happening. So you've got no old defects. And that the new code, the old code that was working is still 100% working. There isn't anything that was introduced, and no aberrant behavior was introduced. Well, you can do that at the end of your sprint, but let's say you've got a 1-week sprint that's 5 days. The first half of the first day, or at least the first quarter of the first day, is planning. The last half of the last day is reviewing in retrospective, or maybe it's only a quarter. But still, that's leaving you with maybe 4 to 4.5 days of development. And if you want to call a code cutoff, let's say your retrospective is Friday morning. If you want to call a code cutoff Thursday morning, that gives your devs 3 days to get everything they're committing to. They're not very happy with that. Your product owner is not very happy that velocity is really slow down. So you're able to lessen that gap, not totally eliminate that gap, but lessen that gap by saying, we're going to push regression testing into the beginning of the next sprint when we don't have new things to test right away anyway. And so just that simple move gives you actually a non-trivial % increase in your coding time for a project. Just blew my mind when I heard about it. The other thing that we've been doing, and we're getting better at this, I wouldn't say we're doing this across the board, but rather than at the end of code cutoff for a sprint, rather than the devs coding ahead, or your UX designer going off to plan ahead so much, everyone starts rolling up their sleeves and actually does the act of testing as it's relevant to them and as they're best able to contribute. So testing is not an activity of quality assurance exclusively. And this has actually allowed us to, again, minimize the amount of time it takes us to fully get through the deliverables that we're doing for the sprint, have more robust test coverage, focus on a broader array of test activities and testing and related activities, and make sure that everyone's adding lots of value to the project. It also prevents the code cutoff for a Friday end of day deliverable to being 5 p.m. on Friday, which I dealt with for a little while. And then the other thing that we've done is we actually never do what I would describe as a full regression test, which is to go through every defect that's ever been generated in your defect database and confirm that that is still fixed. Rather than having that exhaustive effort, which adds questionable value, we use heuristics. Are people familiar with the term heuristics? Or for anyone who's not, to embed it, heuristics is basically just experiential learning. So we leverage our experience in the project and experience in previous projects to determine what the highest risk items are, and we make certain that we check those. And then we prioritize our efforts, and maybe if we have somehow a magical infinite time generation machine, we'll get through everything, but probably not. So we prioritize, just like we prioritize our backlogs on value, we prioritize our testing effort on value.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Because you said you started with that at the end of the sprint, the goal is to deliver a product that works.
Yes.
But if we're not going to regress and test until the beginning of the next sprint, in my experience, that's gambling for one thing for sure, but it's also like almost certainly going to lose at a certain percentage rate each time. Like I'd say for 10 bugs that I get back that are supposedly fixed, there's at least 10% that are not actually fixed, and probably more. So over years and years.
Sure. So the idea is, so what we commit to is robustly testing the code that is being delivered this sprint, right? So we have a gap between code cutoff and delivery, where we say we are going to kick the shit out of every bit of functionality, every user story that we're committing to delivering.
Yeah.
So and we also robustly test all the direct intersection points of that code. So if you're using if an object was refactored, we'll dive into every place that object is leveraged in the code, as well as we can determine. Sometimes things sneak out. And yes, it does introduce risk that in refactoring code or in integrating something, there's this hidden bit that we didn't test that was working 3 sprints ago but isn't working now. But if you evaluate, assuming that your development practice is mature enough to use robust coding standards, The risk is reasonable to assume, given the value that it adds. And so it's a judgment call. So this works for us. It's not necessarily going to work for everybody. Obviously, your mileage may vary. But if you've got, we've got, our development team is pretty good. And so we've developed a trust between Dev and QA that there's not going to be significant issues. We've developed trust between our clients and ourselves that if there is a regression, we'll manage that. And but everyone has determined that the value add of getting an extra day of coding and implementation is greater than the risk that we might break something that was implemented 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So it's really a value proposition.
For sure. I guess I come from an environment where bullet number two, everyone tests, is not necessarily in practice. So
and I'll say this is not across the board.
Yeah.
This is a transformation that we're getting towards. It's solved a lot of problems for us, but there's people who say, oh, that's not my role, I'm not going to do it. There's people who say, I'm too busy with other things.
Right.
There's people who say, I don't know how to do it and I don't want to learn, although we don't have too many of those.
You have a clear way of defining what QA is responsible for testing and what the developer is expected to test as part of their
that's a bit of a negotiation, and I'm using test in a somewhat broad term here.
Right.
So, for instance, a UX designer is probably going to be best suited at ensuring that what they implement in terms of information architecture or user flows is actually what they intended to be implemented, is actually implemented correctly. A dev is probably, it's questionable as to whether the dev should focus on the code they implemented or other code, but it could be code reviews, it could be helping to flesh out unit tests, it could be working on automation frameworks. There's lots of code, test and test related activities that's not necessarily going to be like manually interacting with devices, but whatever is going to add value to the testing effort, the entire team. We're working on getting the entire team on all projects into this mindset. And we've actually had a lot of reasonable success.
So do you groom that story during sprint planning?
This is not, strictly speaking, a story. Oftentimes it's not handled as a story. So, and we can go into what's a good, should you have test stories, or is test a task as part of this larger user story? But the idea is that at some point we're going to say we're stopping coding. Ideally we've met all of our code deliverables at that point, and they've had some amount of testing, and then we do a final validation of all the user stories that we're implementing. And at that point, ideally the entire team swarms again as their capacity, as it best suits their capacity to manage that. So I haven't seen any teams have an everyone test story. It's more like a period of time where all of the user stories that the team is dedicated, committed to delivering are in a state of done, but we haven't quite gotten to the demo yet. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions?
I think, we always have the developers do code reviews because that's an important part of QA that the dev are better qualified for doing. End-to-end tests, maybe the testers can do. And you haven't talked about automation. I don't know.
Well, automation is something we're going to get to.
Regression, okay, cool.
All right. Anything else?
One thing I wanted to add about regression passes, just kind of a comment. I think there's ways to look at regression in levels of value. There's bug regression passes, and then there's feature-oriented regression passes. And I think the more valuable thing to spend time on are those features where bug fixes or perhaps some changes have been done within that feature area. And there you'd want to go back and make sure that that feature hasn't regressed. As far as bug regression passes, I would agree 100%, or not 100%, but a large percent, they're not very valuable. Making sure that you don't break something that you've already delivered is a high value proposition, and so maybe that helps on the regression task point.
Yeah, and to sort of echo that a little bit, you're going to order that by whatever's the highest priority. So maybe you've been refactoring a lot, so you want to regress your features that are touching that code. But there may be things that you haven't touched in 3 sprints. There isn't necessarily a lot of value if that code is stable, not changing, and the services that's interacting with are stable, not changing. I mean, there may be a little value, but you can get to the pesticide paradox where you keep going over the same ground the same way and don't necessarily reveal much in the way of value. So,
but a regression could a failure could give you a lot of value in terms of this.
Right,
the service has failed,
and this is a risk of accepting that the fact that you have limited resources, limited time, you need to prioritize. Anything could break at any moment, causing catastrophic failure. But you need to prioritize, and so having a good sense of how to prioritize, that's pretty key.
Right, we're saying it was a service that failed at sprint 2, and then you don't discover it until sprint 4. There's a lot of additional risk.
I'm not saying that you don't have risk in this, but again, it's about adding value and it's about prioritizing based on what you're able to discern as the highest risks. And so yes, something could be horribly, horribly, horribly broken. There's ways to account for that, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But I'd like to move on just because we are getting a little bit behind in terms of schedule. Unless people really, really want to continue here, and then we'll stop and just have this, we'll stop the presentation and have a conversation. All right, well, the silence has it. Defect management. So we've got, this is sort of related to some of what we were talking about. You've got basically 2 types of bugs. You have bugs that you find in sprint and bugs that you find out of sprint. And I've heard a lot of people say, well, how do we manage that? And so that's kind of just really a mental challenge. In some ways, a logistical challenge. And, another sort of interesting defect management challenge is the fact that, at least as a consultancy, we can sometimes get our clients saying, oh, we're going to use our in-house test team to help you out. Or we're going to be integrating with this other vendor who's developing our backend services, and they'll be testing their stuff. No worries. Or occasionally it's like, well, for whatever reason, we want to employ a third-party testing house where all they're going to do is test. So that can generate a pretty interesting amount of defect reports, which may or may not have a lot of crossover with things that you already know. And so there can be a non-trivial amount of work associated with just managing that testing effort, whether it's just keeping everyone in the loop and merging defects, databases, making certain that you're delegating responsibilities between the multiple parties appropriately. And so that can actually take a lot of time. And user acceptance testing is something that is actually an interesting subset of that, where you've got users or user proxies that your client has, and they come in at the very end and tell you, oh, here's the 20 different things you haven't done yet that we need to do before we ship. And so those are some of the interesting challenges, probably the 3 biggest challenges in terms of defect management. Again, this is sort of the high end of the list of these are things that we've generally been pretty successful at implementing. So for in-sprint defects, so this is defects on code that you've committed to delivering this sprint. The developer codes, checks it in the repository, QA engineer checks out the code, tests based on the definition of done, and says, oh, there's defects. And then dev, fix this. Here's how it's broken, here's the repro steps. And so they iterate. QA and dev iterates, or maybe it's QA and dev and we bring in user experience because we're not really certain about the workflow, or maybe we bring in the product owner because we have a question about the business logic. But we iterate as a team, and the feature isn't done until it's bug-free, mostly. And we'll leave the edge cases to the side for now. But in the idealized state, when you're committing to something, you're delivering it in a bug-free state. And so iterating on in-sprint bugs is fine. But there are things that escape, either something that wasn't caught, or because we didn't know we needed to code for that business logic, or something that we never got, either in our test or production data, a return type that exposed an error state that we didn't properly account for, or something changed and we didn't know about it. So like the service changed in sprint 2, but we didn't know about it until sprint 4. So what do you do? The way we manage those is just a bug is a task. So you've got this, you've got an active product owner, you've got this really beautifully prioritized list of everything you need to do. Top to bottom, top's the most important thing. Single most important thing, you gotta do that before anything else. And so if a bug is a task, you just add it to the priority list wherever it needs to be. So if it's a high priority fix, you put it in there. If it's a low priority fix, maybe you don't get to it. But the product owner, the person who's setting the vision for the project, then gets total empowerment to say, this is important, this is not. And, yeah?
Oh, well, sorry to interrupt you mid-something. You talked about 0 bugs. I was curious if bugs can be filed and then they decide it's not important and then they're not a bug anymore.
You know, in the real world, anything's possible, and that's certain things that happen.
Okay, the reason because you can't ship software with 0 bugs. I mean, there's always going to be, unless you haven't tested it enough. So if you say we're only going to ship with 0 bugs, people are going to be afraid to test. Oh, we've got to stop testing now, otherwise we'll never ship.
No, I wouldn't say that is, at least at Deloitte Digital, that is certainly not the mentality. The mentality is we're going to prove you wrong in order so that we as a team can deliver the highest quality application possible. So when we say 0 bugs, that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be an edge case we haven't accounted for. There isn't going to be a change that happens on the service that we are unaware of that isn't going to result in aberrant behavior. What it really means is we have a user story, so a bit of functionality that we're committing to deliver, and to the best of our ability, there is nothing in that, or best of our ability to determine, there's nothing in that bit of functional code that we're delivering that is unexpected. Now, when you say, can a bug be made a non-bug? Certainly. Once we determine there's an unexpected thing, we can say, oh, well, we know about that, and we don't care. It's a feature. It's a feature, not a bug, exactly. But so in the real world, there's reality. But and I'm talking that's a little tautological, but I'm talking slightly at a higher level than that. This is what we aspire towards. Does that make sense?
I mean, if you've done enough testing, you'll ship with tons of bugs.
Yes.
And you just have to prioritize.
Exactly.
We know about these issues,
kind of the point.
especially because we want to find out about these issues before the customers do. If a customer says, hey, I found this is weird behavior over here, you want to know about it first.
Exactly.
So,
that's why we log things within the prior and put in the backlog, and we let the product owner make that decision as if we're going to ship with it or not. And then, the product owner's team probably writes the documentation somewhere that nobody reads that says all those bugs. Another thing that we've been able to do in terms of just managing the expectations of our clients is talk about trade-offs. So we've got limited time in a sprint. Again, 5 business days, maybe 10 business days all along if our teams are doing 2-week sprints. We've got small teams, even though everyone does participate in the testing process, it's primarily in the realm of QA. And so if we're dealing with a huge amount of documentation management or defect management from our clients' teams, whether it's an internal team or an external team that they hire to augment us, we surface the fact that this is taking away from this. So documentation and defect management is taking away from testing, and we let the client decide. We make the client decide, but we let the client decide what's more important. And if they determine that our time, because let's be honest, they're kind of expensive. If our time is more valuable doing the actual testing and analysis than managing databases of defects, then it's their responsibility to figure out, and we'll work with them, but it's their responsibility to figure out a prioritization of those efforts and accept the consequences of that prioritization. And we are pretty good at shepherding clients through that conversation, because for a lot of clients that's kind of new ground, but we've been pretty successful there. And again, it's just sort of focusing on what's your priority, what's going to add value, and here's a description of the consequences for those decisions as we understand it. So radical honesty. And then the other thing that's again sort of tied to this idea of user acceptance testing is in the Scrum model, user acceptance testing is baked into the system, but it doesn't happen at the end of the project. It happens at the end of every sprint. So at the end of every sprint, you have a sprint review, sprint review, a demo, where you show the client, the product owner, and stakeholders that they want to attend, everything you've delivered. And there could be things that you show them that are broken and say, we know about this. But ideally, nothing's broken, everything's happy, and little fancy elves live in trees and bake cookies. But you show them everything you deliver, and they have the ability to, and we've encouraged our clients to, and they've started adopting the idea that they'll do a mini UAT on that functionality within a very short amount of time. So maybe 1 business day, 2 business days. It's not a lot of stuff. Oftentimes it's not with real end users, but it's with user proxies, and there's good things and bad things with that. But that shifts the burden of, it shifts the activity of user acceptance testing to an earlier point in the process. You can actually do things with the feedback from your users, which is pretty amazing, and not something you often get with user acceptance testing, which happens at the end of a project.
The important thing you should point out there with regard to the earlier 2 items you discussed, Uriah, is once you've delivered from UAT, you've delivered this working feature. When you talk about are there bugs and you have to have negotiation about what the priority is or how much you need to look at, once you've had several cycles where the users who are paying for a product get to use it, and they kind of understand that they're getting something, it puts a lot more pressure on them to make the tougher choices. So it's not happening in a vacuum. It's not like at the end of a long product cycle, we're having a discussion with clients about, do you want this fixed or this fixed? Or do you want to ship today or do you want these bugs fixed? It's happening at the end of every week. And so clients have a very keen understanding of not only what their real priority is for the work coming up, but they also know that there is the opportunity to fix things in a timely manner at some point in the future when maybe it's more important. So once they've gotten the features they really want done, or they might say, no, this is really important. And the magical thing that happens is as you start iterating, people start realizing, or clients start realizing that features they thought they wanted, they don't want anymore. So sometimes that big backlog of bugs, if you don't choose to fix everything, kind of goes away because they decide they don't need that feature or that area, or they've changed their focus based on the real-time feedback of the apps that we're developing. So in terms of bugs and some of the QA issues, when you first just talk about it without having gone through the process, it seems a little hard to believe perhaps, but once you've gotten the trust with the client and they really understand the process, you have a lot more faith that you will deliver something and that it's not critical we fix everything immediately. You can have the perspective of when should it be fixed and what does the client want and what's their priority.
And sir, to go back to an earlier point, the value of Scrum is delivering value. It's forcing the clients to say what is valuable. And oftentimes, at least in my experience, that's a little bit uncomfortable for people in decision-making capacities, but that's kind of why they're paid to make decisions. It's not easy, and it takes a lot of hand-holding, but it's certainly something that we've made a lot of progress with our clients, especially clients who've been engaged with us for a while, and that actually just dramatically improves our ability to consistently deliver value and deliver more and more value as we go.
Isn't another word for that empowerment?
That is a very good word for that. Agency is another word, but that has a couple of different meanings. This is an empowering, or potentially empowering workflow. As long as you don't have dysfunctional
for everyone involved, they're empowered to make decisions on the fly, and they feel like they're working together.
Yep.
Just like in a Scrum.
There you go. All right, we've got about 10 minutes left, and I'm maybe halfway through my presentation. Well, I can floor it, or we can say abandon this. What do we want to do? Raise your hands if you want to me to get through at least the meaty bits. Okay, that looks about half.
Which has the most value? That's the question.
But I'm totally fine with sticking around afterwards until like do this out at 8:30, and then afterwards going somewhere where we can continue the conversation. So I love to talk. All right, so I think I covered everything here, so I'm going to move on. All right, documentation. The real key points here is that Scrum, as a framework, devalues documentation. Most agile processes devalue documentation. That's not to say that there is zero value documentation. It just means that delivering functionality is more valuable, typically speaking, than delivering documentation of functionality. That's sort of at odds with a lot of our clients who come from a very traditional waterfall development cycle, where they really feel uncomfortable without a lot of upfront documentation. And it's even more particular for clients who maybe have FDA requirements that they may or may not fully understand in terms of what their documentation requirements are. And so it's not uncommon for a client to say, yes, we love Agile, we love Scrum, devs, do your thing, we'll work with the backlog, that'll be great. UX, we'll work with UX and iterate a lot, and everything will be great. And then QA, we need all of your test plans and test cases by next week. And you're going to do everything that a traditional waterfall test team is going to do. At this point, I like to remind clients that we have small teams, and we have short sprint cycles, and if the value that they place on the documentation is greater than the value that they place on testing, then that's what we'll deliver. But again, it's about prioritization, it's about forcing hard choices, but again, generally speaking, we found ways to shepherd our clients through these conversations, and just by laying out the facts of the situation. We've got so much time. You want us to do these things. It's going to take this amount of time. What's the value? What do you want us to focus on? The other thing is, we've been able to make tremendous gains in efficiency of our time spent by taking a little bit of time up front and analyzing what the actual intent of the documentation is, and coming up with a solution that's going to meet that intent, even if it isn't exactly according to what the client thinks they need. One of the ways we've been able to do this with tools is to create self-service. So you spend a little bit more time in Jira describing your defect, and a little bit of time up front at the beginning of the project setting up your project structure, so that rather than creating a really robust report, Jira is going to automatically generate that for you. There's coding practices where you can actually auto-generate documentation for your code based off of the comments in the code, as well as the commit notices. And then it takes actually a very minimal amount of time to generate the documentation that the client needs, either for regulatory reporting or to put in the report that their VP will never read, or what have you. So again, this is sort of further down the list. We're not 100% here, but we're making great strides in the self-service of documentation and getting our clients into the mindset of, again, delivering value, making those tough choices.
So you're right. Sorry to slow you down, but I think this is a really important point about documentation, because let's suppose a good documentation is not going to overspecify. Because if you do overspecify, you're probably going to contradict yourself anyway. So, and given that big requirements up front means you're basically going to specify, let's assume that we can in theory figure out everything that our product is, we think that it has to do. We specify it all in front for a more like waterfall-like approach. But you're telling me that, of course, Agile de-emphasizes documentation, but what do you leave out?
Well, that could be a very long conversation.
All right, we'll follow up later.
Yeah,
it's domain, product, and ecosystem specific.
Yeah,
I mean, your support organization is going to need certain kinds of information, and if you're just moving, at your convenience and imposing costs on them, you probably made an error.
Yeah.
There are a lot of zero tolerance places depending on the product. Payment processor, guess what? It better do it right.
Yeah.
Because you're going into the legal world. Same thing with personal identify information and security.
Yep.
And HIPAA, and so it just depends on the domain.
In some of those situations, I think at that point when there's a regulatory overlay, the documentation actually becomes part of the deliverable. So a lot of times when we talk about documentation, we talk about specs that no one's ever read once they've been written. We're talking about overly complex internationalization plans that, once again, they have some information in them, but they could have just been a bulleted list to remind you to don't forget these 3 things that we're going to support. And so what we're not necessarily focusing on some of the regulatory things, because in that situation, those are probably stories that are actually part of what you're delivering. Because you may need something from a dev. It's not, your dev doesn't just deliver code, they may deliver some detailed specification about how that code works. And that's really part of the story, as opposed to documentation that most of us don't really like because it's sort of busy.
And at the same time, I've seen plenty of blog posts, I've seen presentations, and I've had experienced this somewhat, although I haven't had a lot of projects, I haven't been directly involved in a lot of projects that have an FDA regulatory requirement, for example. But I've seen this where, I don't believe it's just me, where the client or whoever you're building for says, I need this, I've always gotten this, so this is what I need, without really critically analyzing what the actual regulation is that they're trying to meet, what the letter of the law is. And so doing a little upfront analysis of what you actually need to give, as opposed to just accepting that you need to deliver this really difficult to create or time-intensive.
Some documentation is actually evidence. And in fact, if your process doesn't generate it, you're doing it wrong. So, when you start talking about FDA and those different areas, if there's any chance that this was done by hand, the auditor's looking for it, because that's a system you can gain.
Yeah, and this goes back to the idea of self-service, right? Which can be sort of expanded to just the idea of automated documentation.
What is Jira before you?
Oh, sorry. Jira is a defect. Who does Jira?
It's work management, defect tracking, customizable.
There's actually a full suite that could include that wiki and source control if you want. We use Jira as our primary defect tracking system, but certainly any defect tracking system can work.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions before we move on to automation? And I'm guessing some of you might have some more robust questions, given the time that we've got. What was that? 130 seconds. We're probably going to this. But we can talk more about it later. So given the fact that and I'm going to be a little bit more specific to mobile here, and I'll start at the bottom. Mobile has a lot of immature tool sets that just literally do not give you the functionality you would have for automation, for a desktop client, or a standard web client. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but they're immature. And given the fact that we've got short sprints, small teams, and the other thing, which I didn't talk about yet, is the fact that most of our project cycles last about 10 to 12 weeks. So short timelines. And the way our business is structured, you don't always know ahead of time whether that project's ever going to continue. Now, some of our clients, it's a pretty safe bet, but other clients, it doesn't always happen. So there's a real question about the value of robust automation, especially functional automation, in our process. And so, and this is actually, especially given the immaturity of the tools, this is a pretty difficult challenge for us, which we are in the process of sorting out. And the real takeaway, because I don't have much more than 20 seconds, is iteration and incrementalism is how we've managed to start to make real progress here. So we started using a continuous integration system, but from there we were able to deploy to not just check if it can build, but we were able to deploy to emulators, simulators, and actual devices. And from there we're able to create a UI automation framework for iOS and for Android, which allows us to have build verification tests every time a code gets checked in without any manual intervention. And that's where we're at right now. Most projects have that. And we're working on fleshing out the frameworks for automation so that we can do more robust UI automation faster at a lower cost. But unfortunately, I'm over my time. I'm here all week, and next week too.
But let you leave. Napping on the couch.
I will. I'll stick around until 8:30. Can we continue, or do we have to cut it here?
We kind of got to wrap it.
Okay.
So just because a lot of people have to get going. So anybody else?
I believe the rest of the presentation is available online. If it's not, we'll make certain that it's available online in PDF format. It's got, follow me on Twitter, reach out to me. I'd love to continue the conversation later. Come to Matcom on Friday, October 19th, and we can have all of these great conversations there. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
We have our standard drawing.